I'm going to talk to you today about state of possession, in particular the alternation between have and have got in English. For instance, we can say he has the book or he has got the book. But what I'm particularly interested in is where things become a little bit more complicated, which is with negation. So just to give you a flavour of what I'm looking at here, if we have a negated verb phrase, we can say, for instance, he hasn't the book. If you're having a contracted hasn't there, you can have hasn't got. You can instead contract the auxiliary to he's not got, or you can use do support and have he doesn't have the book. Okay, so this is what I'm interested in, and we're going to explore this overlapping sort of area where essentially two separate linguistic variables intersect. So just to give you a taste of the properties of have and have got, because obviously that determines their syntactic distribution. In British English, at least, have can be either lexical or auxiliary. So is a lexical verb, you use do support, and there's no contraction of the verb itself, so we can say I don't have any. And alternatively, we can have as an auxiliary and contract it onto the subject, like I've not any, or have not contraction with I haven't any. And with the indefinite DPs, like any, we can also have negative indefinites instead, like I've no money. Okay, so I've just given that example in brackets. Although that's a kind of different element in a way, because it's not verbal negation, but you have it as a negative indefinite in the DP object. On the other hand, have got, the status of have here is as an auxiliary, and here we have no do support whatsoever, so you wouldn't say I don't have got any, but you can contract as you could with the auxiliary have, but use got alongside it. So a little bit about the historical trajectories here. So what changes happen and at what time? Because first off, we know that do support came in around the 15th century, but it wasn't actually initially used with these stative contexts that I'm interested in. But it's been suggested that do support is actually increasing in present day British English. Then a bit later, around the 16th century, have got first came in as an alternative to have in the stative context. And it's been suggested that in British English there's a general change towards have got for the expression of a stative possessive. For instance, by Noble, 1985, and then later in Tagliamonte, 2003. Then there's a different kind of picture in the likes of Canadian English, where there's a change towards have as opposed to have got. So Tagliamonte et al. 2010 report that have is a near categorical stative variant and have got is hardly used at all. And actually in North American varieties, have got is somewhat stigmatized, which it isn't really in British English, at least as far as I'm aware. Then later, do support became possible in the stative context that I'm interested in for this talk. So this is a much later change, around the 19th century. So what's going on now, right? That's what my kind of question is. And so if we focus in on the negative stative context, okay, so negation of have and have got, what we know is that in Canadian and New Zealand English, don't have is used near categorically. So in both Canadian and New Zealand English, we can say that have is a lexical verb, we have to use do support. Whereas in British English, there's some sort of conflicting claims. So Noble suggests that have got is favoured in British English in the negative context, though it may be because this study's a bit older, perhaps things have since changed. And another more recent study by Ferringer and Corrigan on Tyneside English suggests that the opposite is true, so that have is actually favoured in negative stative context. So it's this kind of muddled picture of British English that I'm aiming to explore today. So my question is, if both do support and have got are on the rise, what is the current state of the state of possession variation under negation? So we know that, well, from suggestions in the literature, that do support is on the rise. If have got is also on the rise, that seems to be conflicting because we can't have don't have got. So what is the trade-off between those two changes? And also, has the syntactic status of have as either an auxiliary or lexical verb changed over time, because obviously that will determine the patterns that we see. So methodology. So essentially here I'm looking at 9 different alternatives, and the ones, if I come here for a second, the ones in the italics here are only relevant if you have an indefinite in the object. Okay, so I kind of deal with those a bit later as a separate case. But essentially for have, we have don't have, so do support on the top here, and then either auxiliary contraction like I've not, versus neg contraction, which is I haven't, or with any subject. And here's the indefinite I have no, so bare verb, versus I've no with the contraction. Then with have got, we have the same set of 4 that we have for the have, but no do support. So to explore this, I used the British National Corpus from 2014, because there's a newer version now, which includes spoken conversation from 2012 to 2016. And currently these transcripts are searchable via a web server. And so I sampled for conversations between 2 speakers who spoke a native dialect of British English that were part of the core set of the corpus as a whole. So the authors describe this as a more socially and regionally balanced subsample, whereas there are some additional ones, but they're not as balanced. Okay, and this creates a 2.5 million word subsample. So to extract all those sort of 9 alternatives I mentioned, I used this series of search terms where the braces indicate any form of have, so it could be contracted or could be spelled out in full, and kept all instances of stative possessive have or have got in negative declaratives. So these are examples of verbal negation like have not got or have not. And the negative indefinites like have no or have got no. So when you get the results, of course you get a lot of noise that comes out as well. So I excluded any cases where have and have got are not interchangeable with the same meaning. Any non-possessive functions, so modals like I've got to go, dynamic uses like I have breakfast every day, because they don't mean the same thing. Any past tense, have got and have because. Quinn suggests that it's not actually possible. She gives a syntactic analysis that prevents past tense had got, and she says that actually when you use a past tense had got, it refers more to the process of obtaining something rather than the end result of possessing it. So if you say, oh, he'd got a car, you're talking more about the process of getting the car than having the car. Excluded questions for now, but this is kind of at the starting point of a project, and eventually I will come back to questions because obviously it's relevant to the do support issue, whether it occurs in questions as well. And then false starts and incomplete utterances, because if they start saying I have and then they get interrupted, you don't know if they were going to say got or not. So the first set of results concerns the sort of present day status of the variation and how this has developed over time. And for starters, here's the kind of synchronic picture and overview of the overall distribution. So focusing on the left-hand column with the verbal negation, we see a clear so just clear dichotomy between two major variants, don't have and haven't got, which make up over 95% of all of the data. There is some slight, this isn't shown, but there's some slight use of this form, the neg contracted have, but only 5 tokens, and 4 out of 5 are the phrase haven't a clue, which has been suggested this is a fixed phrase. And so from this result, we can say, well, it looks like have is lexical in British English, in mainstream British English as represented in the corpus, whereas the auxiliary function is not as productive. With the negative indefinites, the main distinction is between have no versus contracted have got no, so like he's got no, for instance. Again, there's a little bit more variation, so we can have auxiliary contraction, so there is contraction in that environment, but again, mostly these are frozen expressions, so the phrase no idea, like I've no idea, okay? And so there's very little use of have as an auxiliary. In terms of how this has changed over time, what I did was look at, firstly, the verbal negation context, where auxiliary and neg contraction are both interchangeable. And if we look in apparent time, according to the age of the speaker in the British National Corpus, what we see is that do support is increasing. So this is don't have on the blue, the dark blue line there going upwards, and a decrease in the haven't got alternative. So remember, they were the two major variants, and we see that they intersect. So that haven't got used to be the majority variant, now is used a lot less. And the same kind of picture comes out of the negative indefinites, like he has no time. So you see, again, an increase in the have variant, this time a bare have, like I have no time, or he has no time, whereas the auxiliary contracted have got decreases. So when we combine these just by the main two stative variants, have and have got, what we see is that have is on the rise in apparent time in both the verbal negation and the negative indefinite context. So the second part instead looks at some of the grammatical constraints on this, in particular looking at the effect of the subject. Because in the literature there are two independent claims that I came across which are from the stative literature and the contraction literature. So first off, in the stative literature, it's been found that have is used at higher rates with NP subjects than with pronouns, okay? So you would tend to get the man has a car as opposed to he has a car, okay? So with pronouns, you would tend to say he has got a car, right? And then in the contraction literature, they've looked, in the contraction literature, they look at have and they look at be and all different verb patterns, but they find that auxiliary contraction is used at higher rates with pronouns than MPs, okay? So this led me to think there's something going on here, these must be connected. And so my hypothesis was that the higher percentage of have, as opposed to have got, with NPs is because MPs resist contraction. And as we saw earlier from the previous set of results I showed you, we know that have is rarely contracted and have got was nearly always contracted, okay? Which is what you might expect if we're moving towards have being a lexical verb in British English. And so as negative indefinites are somewhat structurally similar to affirmatives, which is where these kinds of claims came from, we can expect to see a greater percentage of have with NPs in that context, precisely because they disfavour auxiliary contraction. Okay, So if we can't contract have, then we're going to see more have with NPs because you can't contract with NPs, essentially. So here's what we see. So here's the negative indefinite. So I've split it by pronoun versus NP, but also contexts where you could auxiliary contract versus not, okay? Just to see whether the sort of rates of use are similar. And what we actually see is that when you just look at the context where auxiliary contraction is possible, it doesn't actually make a difference what the subject is, because you can use 50-50 have got, 50-50 have got, okay? So the subject actually doesn't make much of a difference on your choice of have or have got if you can contract, okay? However, in the context where you can't contract, then you get 90 and 100% have, okay? Now, what's interesting here is that when you look at the number and distribution of tokens here, pronouns make up a huge amount of the data, so 306 tokens, and most of them allow contraction, right? So pronouns generally end with vowels, except for it, perhaps. So like he, I, she, you, we, all end in vowels, and vowels allow contraction pretty easily. So you can say he's, I've, we've, yeah. Whereas with NPs, they're a bit lower in number to start with, plus a lot of the time they don't allow you to contract. So this is for phonotactic reasons. So as I'll come on to, NPs generally prohibit aux contraction because, for example, you might have a relative clause, so the men who have I keep using car for an example. The men who have a car, which you can't technically contract have because you get what's called an intermediate form, which Mackenzie talks about. So if you say the men who've, you can say who have. Some speakers say they can contract the have in that example actually, but when I looked in the corpus, it wasn't found at all. So it's not actually very productive. But there are other contexts like there's a sentence in the corpus something like a fox has something, and so fox ends in a sibilant, and sibilants can't allow contraction. So you can't say a fox's. It's got an intermediate schwa in there, not like he's, which is a straight contraction. So NPs generally disfavour contraction because of phonotactic reasons, and we saw earlier that have got is nearly always contracted because the have is an auxiliary and have is a lexical verb, so it is not. So what we can say here is that Tallimont et al.'s finding from the Stative study of have and have got, they show that have is preferred with NPs, but what this data shows is that it's a product of the different phonotactic restrictions with NPs versus pronouns and the status of the have versus have got as lexical versus auxiliary. So to conclude, so at least in the British National Corpus it would appear that have has become lexical in mainstream British English. Now we do still know of dialects where it is possible, and so the next thing I'm going to do is look at the regional distribution because there are some sort of remote Scottish areas that still do this quite a lot, and I know that the British National Corpus, for all they've tried to be quite balanced about it, there is still a bias towards Southern Englishes, and so that could be partly why we don't see as much auxiliary have. Have is increasing over time, both in the verbal negation and the negative context, negative indefinite context, at the expense of have got. And the syntactic status of have versus have got leads to a greater use of have in contexts where auxiliary contraction is impossible or dispreferred. So we can explain the subject constraints on stative possession by considering this interaction between these different areas of variation. And finally, by considering the historical context of the changes and the intersection between them, we can better understand the envelope of variation and not just consider contraction, negation and stative possession as separate things, but that actually they all intersect with one another, and we need to consider it as a system as a whole to see how variation and change with one variable can have consequences for another. And that's it. Thank you very much.